Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa bihi nasta'een. Allah says in the Quran, Surah Al-Naml, which is Surah 27, Ayah 16. عرف سليمان داود وقال يا أيها الناس علمنا منطق الطير وأوتينا من كل شيء إن هذا لهو الفضل المبين. And he gave it air. He said, O people, you have been taught the speech of birds, and you have been given of everything. This is indeed Allah's mercy and grace. The ayah that confirms to us that all existing things, all created entities, in their own way have a mechanism whereby they recognize their primordial blueprint and are in a state of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The language of the birds, at one level, is the way in which the birds communicate. But at the same time, and yet at another level, it is a language which is inherent in the way that all animals, all created things, all existing entities reflect in their genetical and spiritual blueprint the ibadah, the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Attar, which is the speech of the birds, or the famous allegorical poem of the whole corpus of sufi literature by the great master Attar, Attar. Before we go into discussing this masterpiece of literature, the birds in their untold multitudes gather to find a king, and in the process of following the poo-poo or the hudhud, they reach a state of realization, and they reach a state of inner certainty. Before we discuss that, I would like to spend some time, inshallah, on discussing the symbols that are used throughout the universe of Tassawuf, and the symbols that are used not only in Tassawuf but in all systems of inner awakening and inner enlightenment that cover the entire spectrum of the inner dimensions of Islam. These are very, very important mechanisms and means by which those who are on an inner journey or have reached a certain state or hal or maqam, a certain station, reflect the reality of things in a way that is metaphoric and symbolic, rather than reflecting directly in language whose capacity might not be sufficient to express the intent and content of this. Symbols, that is the use of indications, the use of allegory, the use of inference, the use of certain images, certain structures, certain patterns, is an integral part of all the literature of the inner way. And before we read any of these great works, before we dive into them, it is important to understand the symbols that they refer to. It is important to understand how these symbols relate to the language of the inner way, of the inner journey. So, the language of Tassawuf, or the language that we use in order to achieve a state of inner enlightenment, is the language of the Rumuz, as we call it in Arabic, the language of symbols, of which there are really few. There are the universal symbols, and there are the particular symbols. The universal symbols occur in the nature and structure of things. They are intrinsic to entities, they are intrinsic to all existent matter. And they are part of the divine pattern, they are part of the divine creation. For example, when we refer to the word, or al-kalima, or when you refer to the pen, which in Arabic is the qalam, or the lawh, which is the tablet. These are all metaphors and symbols for divine realities that go beyond their simple apparent meaning. And all the universal symbols that we use in our way, inshallah, are derived from their Quranic roots, from their Quranic origin. And they form very fundamental part in nearly all Islamic art, in calligraphy, in music, in poetry, in architecture, and so on. There are certain symbols that are repeated, that are apparent, that stick out, and we have to recognize these symbols for what they are. So when we see, for example, a poem that discusses the pen, or a piece of carpentry where there are repetitive patterns, these patterns are all integrated into the sense of the universal. And ultimately they all owe their origin to the Quranic understanding of these symbolic meanings. And they all ultimately go back to the fact and reality that the Quran itself is the prayer, the intelligence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the form of words. So the word or the kalima, we frequently come across the kalima, which is the word, is the heart and is the kernel of all symbolic allusions in Tassawuf. Then the word emanates the forms in which the word expresses itself. So both in light and in sound, they have their reverberations. So the use of light, the image of light and the symbol of light, you find it throughout Islamic literature in Arabic, in Persian, in Turkish, in Urdu, and so on. And light seen in that way is a reflection of the word as it emanates from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And sound, when we hear again the sound, there are frequent references in Sufi poetry to the sound, to the crash of drums and the sound of trumpets and so on. They reflect the return of the word back to its origin in the Day of Judgment, or Yawm al-Ma'ad, or Day of Qiyamah. Similarly, light, because it has a direction and emanates from a source, it has again the symbol that is used frequently in Sufi literature, and generally now in Islamic literature, is the symbol of the niche from which light emanates and originates. The word, and from the word light and sound, and the origin of light, and the locus of light, and sound in its reverberations, are all universal symbols that are found in all literature dealing with the inner world. And it is important that when you come across them, when you do read some of these great works, and I strongly encourage all of you to read and to delve into them. And probably the easiest introduction to these works is Attar's works, because it is quite concise and it is a very, very moving and as well as entertaining story. Universal symbols will end up with particular symbols, and I discussed, for example, the constant reference across the spectrum of Sufi literature to, for example, trees, or pens, or mountains, or beauty, or names of ladies like Layla, or names of lovers like Majnun, and so on. These are particular symbols that occur frequently and throughout, and their origin really is found in the way in which these symbols are manipulated by the author, or by the writer, or by the architect, or by the poet, in order to reflect certain realities that he's experiencing. And the symbols of Sufi literature, as well as generally of Islamic art, really fall into three main categories. There are symbols relating to the cosmos as a whole, to the understanding of the cosmos. There are symbols relating to the psychology of the person or the seeker, and there are symbols relating to revelation. For example, the beauty of the Prophet Yusuf is a symbol of certain realities. The fire of Ibrahim is also a symbol of his proximity, of his intimacy with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these categories of cosmological symbols that are frequently repeated, psychological symbols, and revelatory symbols are part and parcel of the literature of the inner way, which if we don't understand what these symbols mean, we find we can only relate to them at the apparent level and therefore lose the true significance and substance. For example, the tree is always mentioned. What is a tree when looked at in the context of Sufi poetry? What does it mean? It is basically the tree as it reflects in the Quran, that is something that is firmly set in invocation, firmly set in dhikr and remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And its branches reach out to the heights, and the fruit is the reality that we achieve by examining this tree. And that the fruit of this tree of life ultimately is based upon, it's anchored in the soil of knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as it grows and gives fruit, it's the fruit of reality, of haqiqah. We also come across many times references to Mount Arf. And Arf is the first letter of Surah Al-Qaf. And it has been used throughout literature, in particular Persian literature of this period, that was of the 5th and 6th century, as basically an allegory a symbol of the mountain that the seeker has to climb in order to reach the point of that mountain. And the point of the mountain is the point where all creation emanates. And so Mount Arf, when we come across climbing Jabal Arf in Attar's book, where the Sinur, that is the ultimate mystical entity, the ultimate mystical that, and I'll explain that later inshallah, resides. Jabal Arf or Mount Arf has a certain meaning. And in Sufi literature it means that structure which is firmly rooted at the divine Sharia. It is rooted in the Sharia, that as the mountain climber goes up, it is a reflection of the way of the spiritual path, and the point of that mountain is the point at which all creation emanates. So Mount Arf is basically a symbol of all created entity and the arc of ascent back to the origins that we all emanate from. It is the infinite expanse of space at the point, and its tip, that is at the point of infinity, it is what we call the naqta, or the point. And when we say that all creation, all knowledge is in the point of the Bismillah, the dot under the bar of Bismillah, this is what is meant. It is a symbol and a reflection that all reality emanates from a single point and a single source. And to reach that source, to reach that point, you have to climb Mount Arf. And Mount Arf is replete with all kinds of obstacles, all kinds of valleys, all kinds of rocks and stones and chasms. But for the true seeker, climbing Mount Arf, which is based on this divine Sharia, reaches us to the point of all knowledge of existence and creative things. That is, it is the mystic way. It is the way of the true gnostic and the true halal. The infinite expanse of the cosmos at that point comes down into the dwelling place where we all are. And the dwelling place where we all are must be based upon the firm foundations of the Sharia. Climbing Mount Arf is in fact the path. It's in fact the way. The higher we climb up that path, the smaller things appear to us. The less we think things are in terms of their value, the higher up we go. The lower down we are the mountain, the more things appear to be more substantive. The higher up we go, the less they become significant, until we reach a different level of reality. So, in the poems of Tassawuf, when the poet talks about Mount Arf and climbing up the trees of Mount Arf, until you reach the state where the tree line hits, that tree line really reflects the state at which the seeker, the murid, the adept, has lost contact permanently with existent entities and is now in the world of no form, until he reaches the peak. And at the peak is the point, and the point is a reflection of perfection, and perfection is that of the universal man, or the Prophet ﷺ. Again, Attar, and also the other great poets, Sanai, Attar, Hafiz in his own way, Sa'di, talk about the pen and the tablet. The pen emanates from, it writes with ink, and the ink is the infinite knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the pen is the active force. The pen is the mechanism by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifests the knowledge that is in the inkwell. So we come across many times the ink. We come across many times the symbol of the pen. And it means the ink is the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The pen is the mechanism, or the process by which that pen writes, that is, transfers this knowledge. And where it transfers that knowledge, it transfers that knowledge to a tablet, a lawh al-mahfuz. So again, we come across the expressions tablet, pen, ink, and so on. And they reflect really the combination of the opposites, the naqidain, the pen element, but its action is of no consequence unless it's written on something. So pen, masculine, pen, active, tablet, feminine, receptive. And it is this, the essence of all things, is inscribed by the transfer of the ink of Allah's knowledge through the action of the pen onto the tablet. And the tablet itself is where the universal soul, or the ruh al-nur al-Muhammadi, the ruh that from which all prophecy emanates and culminates in the person of the Prophet ﷺ, is inscribed. And the Quran as a whole is the tablet as we see it in its phenomenal form, in the form that we receive it. So again, the interplay in the poets between ink, pen, tablet, and Quran must be seen in light of this nexus. We see frequently discussion and mention and description of gardens. And garden is an elemental part of all Islamic literature, especially of Sufi literature. And all the great shuyukh, when they compose their poems, and where they compose their qasidas, the symbol of the garden and what the gardens are and what they mean should also be seen in that light. So it should be also seen metaphorically. It is not only the garden of the Jannah. The gardens that they are referring to are the 4 gardens of paradise that we find in Surah Al-Rahman. Gardens, each are the processes by which the adept or the mystic reaches higher and higher levels of realization and understanding. So we move from the garden of the soul, which is hadiqat al-nafs, onto the garden of the heart, which is hadiqat al-qalb, onto the garden of the spirit, which is hadiqat al-ruh, and finally hadiqat al-haqiqah, which is one of the points, the garden of the essence, or the garden of reality. And each of these gardens has its own way stations, has its own maze, has its own problems, has its own perils. And the processes by which the seeker, the wayfarer, the salik, passes from one garden to the next is the process by which more and more knowledge is gained. So when we hear or when we read about the garden of the heart, it really refers to a certain set of conditions or hals by which the adept is able to relate to his state or to his station. All of the gardens that we find in all the great poets are really composed of 3 elements. Well, 4. There's a way to the heart of the garden at which there's a fountain. From the fountain emanates water, and next to the water is a fruit tree. And to get to the heart of the garden, we have to go through a maze. And the maze has its perils. And the perils of that maze are part and parcel of the processes of reaching the fountain of that garden. So if you take the garden of the nafs, it is not what we see around us. One should not see it as the joys and pleasures of the world. The garden of the nafs is the garden at which the seeker, who has been awakened in a state of yaqza, reaches the fountain which gives him the water of nourishment that brings him up to the next station. So the fountain, for example, of the garden of the heart is the fountain whereby forms and ideas, as we understand them, are disembodied from their phenomenal matter. They become archetypes, basically. And this garden, the fountain of that garden, allows us to disassociate meaning from the appearance of meaning. So it is a certain state that requires the salik to have already embarked on this journey. Again, the water that emanates from the fountain has its source from another fountain, which is the fountain of the garden of the heart, and so on, as we go up the stage. So the poets, when they talk about gardens, they usually relate them to one of these four gardens that they are in. And they relate the story of the wayfarer in a particular point to the station of that garden. So it becomes a symbol and a metaphor for where that person is in terms of his progress and movement along the path. And ultimately, you reach the garden of the essence, which has in its form the reflection of being a complete man. Through the process of annihilation, you have gone through Qana, and finally you have drunk from the water of permanence, which is the ultimate being, the ultimate proximity to Allah subhanahu. It allows you to go up and up the scale and ladder of inner knowledge, reflected in a way that adepts could understand and could relate to. So, in many ways, I found, in my case, that if you are able to relate yourself to certain conditions or states that can be described visually or imaginably, you are much more able to gain the kernel and the core of what you're trying to do, rather than to keep on manipulating ideas with your station, ideas with your level of ma'rifah or gnosis. So these ways were all ways by which it encouraged the adept or the seeker to be able to reflect in a level of realization that he or she is capable of. What we're discussing today, inshallah, will be Attar's The Conference of the Birds, but the birds as a whole, as a spectrum of the animal world, are a very, very important symbol of Islamic literature. And each bird really has its own reflection in a certain state or condition of the self. Basically, birds in Islamic literature, or Sufi literature in particular, reflect the spiritual faculties. They reflect the various components that make the self. So, as a symbol, for example, of longing, that's a symbol of the need and love of what is familiar, and that's the duck in water. You have another bird who is a symbol of being a prisoner to his physical appetites, and that's the hawk and his prey or his food. So each of the birds that we are talking about, each bird really has its own category and its own reflection. So when the poet talks about the nightingale, he does not really mean a nightingale as such, or a bird that has a beautiful voice, a bulbul, we call the nightingale in Arabic. He is really referring to the self that is in a state of permanent longing for something that is ephemeral. Usually the nightingale is coupled with the rose, and the nightingale yearns for the beauty of the rose and the smell of the rose, even though the rose has thorns. But the opposite of that is that the rose decays and the rose dies. So the nightingale as a metaphor for trying to seek beauty and permanence in the physical world, in the world of phenomena, is a frequently used example. The use of that, or the basis of that, of this allegory, as it were, is in this apple. At another level, the language of the birds, or Mantaqat, is also the language that is based on rhythm. It's based on repetition of a certain pattern. So the earthly language of the birds, which must have its cosmic reflection, as it were, is the rhythmic sound. And rhythm is a very, very important element in all Islamic artifacts, all Sufi forms also. So for example, in poetry, the matnu and the da'i form reflects the rhythm of the sounds that are part and parcel of recognizing the divine reality. That's why not many people who are on the inner way can relate to the kind of nonsense that passes through. Happiness that comes from the rhythmic repetition at a level that approaches the divine reality. The science of rhythm and the management of rhythms leads to higher states. That's why dhikr is done usually in a rhythmic fashion. That's why you have rhythmic patterns repeating themselves, for example, in lattice work, or certain structures and orders relating to carpentry design. And I think subsequently also, in one or two other cases, the hoopoe or the hudhud is taken to be the bird that symbolizes the inspired self or the awakened self. So when the hudhud or the hoopoe comes about or crops up in verse, it is usually the metaphor for the self that has become intuitively inspired and therefore is able to embark on the journey. The hudhud or the hoopoe guides is a leader. Those birds who chose the hoopoe as their leader. The nightingale rose, I discussed the way in which the nightingale is posed positive against the rose, and the nightingale being the bird or the self that seeks its delight and seeks its desires in the phenomenal world. The duck and water, the duck unable to leave the water because it wants to be in familiar surroundings, the hawk and its prey. And all of these birds, once their self is awakened by the presence of the hudhud or the hoopoe, who represents wisdom in its inspired self, are also able to move up and say, yes, we will go on this journey. Also the symbol of the bird escaping from the cage, escaping in a flight into soaring into the open spaces, is a frequently repeated and frequently found symbol throughout Sufi thought. For example, Ruzbihan Bakri, the great master of Shiraz, soul is seen as a bird, and the symbol of the bird frequently appears throughout his writing. Of course, in Rumi's works, the bird is always crops up in many, many instances. But we have to see it in terms of its symbolic, what kind of bird it is, and whether the bird is seen as the soul that escapes, that is, it escapes its bodily track and moves on. Other symbols that frequently occur is the symbol of the guide. And the guide in his takwini sense, that is in his universal sense, that is the guide who is governed by the name Al-Hadi, that is the guided one. Or the guide that is represented in the tashri'i sense, which is in the sense of the person or the prophetic person who establishes laws. So again, in Rumi, for example, we come across people who are guides, but they are the guides in the universal sense, that is, they are imbued with the spirit of guidance given to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Khidr, for example, the Prophet Khidr alayhi salam, frequently comes up as the guide of certain people, but that's a guide in the universal sense. And there are guides who teach people, direct people, guide people, and so on. They are again seen as a reflection of the perfected self, who is a reflection of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Symbols of gateways, bridges, arches, and so on reflect their inner dimension too. So the gateway or the path is frequently seen as the entrance to the journey. So people walking through doors, people going through gateways, entering cities through arches. This must be seen in the inner sense. Also, if we are to get the full impact and import of what is being written. Bridge is the symbol of man. So when you come, or mankind, or human being, so when you come across the symbol bridge, or when you see people crossing bridges, or bridges being thrown up, they are basically reflecting the reality of a human being as a barzakh, as an interspace between one form of creation, that is the phenomenal creation, the lump the mass creation of a physical entity and the capability of reaching the divine. So the bridge is a reflection of the inspired and awakened human being who recognizes his interspace. We come across many times instances of references to jinn, for example. Jinn, seen in the context of literature and read in the context of anabolical literature, is usually the reflection of psychic forces that disturb and deflect and cause us to deviate. And pop up in various forms. But they are generally jinn that cause disturbances to the seeker. Dragon or a tinni is also symbols of disturbances and symbols of it's part of a cosmological symbol of sun and moon, but it's rather complicated at this point. It's basically a node from which the wayfarer goes into and comes out of. The Kaaba in Sufic lore, in the inner way, is seen to be the focal point of the divine essence as it emanates on earth. The black stone, again, we have mentioned frequently in poetry, many times, stories relating to the black stone, and they are really the reality of the human essence. So while the Kaaba is the divine essence that we can understand it in terms of our own human level, the black stone is the human essence. And the tawaf, that is going around the Kaaba, is seen as a way, again in Sufi literature, of circling around the human essence that allows us to go up vertically through that point. So when we say those who have realized their Hajj bring the Kaaba with them, it is this sense that the internalization of the purpose of the Hajj in the inner way, that is the purpose of the whole exercise. As a metaphor for the potentialities of reaching the divine essence. And the Kaaba and the black stone as a metaphor of the potentialities of the human essence constantly crop up. About Qaf, Mount Qaf being the cosmic symbol of the way in which the wayfarer moves from the gross to the subtle, where he moves from the base of the divine Sharia to the point where all creation is gathered into the unity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's also the tuba tree, the trees that you sometimes find on Persian carpets also have a certain meaning. And at one level they reflect the potentiality of reaching inner knowledge. So the tuba of the person is that tree inside us that through cultivation allows us to reach the cosmic tuba. So you'll find certain patterns on Persian carpets where there is a tree and inside it there's another tree. And these trees really reflect the fact that this is the entire tree of knowledge, which is capable of being reflected within us in the inner tree, in the smaller tree. And the great Nasr ibn Arabi had a whole treatise on this tree, which he calls Shajarat al-Kawn, the tree of creation. It is the tree of knowledge that reflects the divine command, be kun. When we see Islamic forms that are constantly repeated, it is really a reflection of the fact that there is multiplicity in unity. So the lattice works that we find that are repeated time and time again, or patterns that appear to be repeated endlessly and are recognizably Islamic. It is not because they are Islamic in the sense that somehow they have a certain cultural connotation to them, because there is a purposeful design, and that purpose is to show that in multiplicity there is unity. So it leads to unity. All these repeated patterns are patterns that lead to recognition of the one. Again, color schemes. All color schemes in true inner-oriented literature in Islam have a certain meaning and a certain substance to them. Red, for example, is the color of fire, which is also the elements of having heat and dryness. Blue is the element, the color that reflects earth, which has a cold and dry aspect. Yellow is the color of air, green is the color of water, and so on. And in some of the great masters and shuyukh, in some of the well-known tariqas, for example the Khalwatiyya, use the color schemes, and it's not 4 but 7 generally. And they relate these color schemes to certain symbols and patterns in the cosmos that allows the initiate to basically relate to these substances and to these symbols in order to reach and to enhance his inner awakening. And we have the constant use of the symbol of beauty and majesty. And beauty and majesty, being the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, must be seen also in their masculine and feminine component. Beauty is the feminine component. It's the component that allows us to understand splendor, beauty, and it has an expansive quality to it. So the reference to beauty, which is usually in poetry, is associated with, for example, poems relating to Layla. It is really the Layla that reflects the divine beauty, the beauty that is related to the person who is in a state of expansiveness, in a state of bust, and it relates to the splendor of creation and created entities that are merely a reflection of the beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Other aspect of it, which is Jalal, which is majesty, is sometimes seen to be more masculine. It is related to a sense of the limitation of the self in front or in face of the divine power. So there's an element of contraction to it, there's an element of limitation, and there's a recognition of the element of limitation. And the seeking of beauty and majesty is a theme in many of the poems. And the one that is most famous, of course, is Layla and Majnun. But this is repeated again in other stories like Salman and Attar and so on. As it were, that in unity reach their apogee, are reflected in about the use of the dot and the meaning of the dot, and why frequently they say all knowledge is in the dot, or Rumi mentions many times the knowledge being under the dot, or his wisdom being encompassed in the dot. There's also sometimes a scene in an ambiguous way. For example, the mole on the face. The mole on the face is seen sometimes as a mark of beauty and perhaps has a certain erotic side to it. But with the insight that we have from the purposes of Sufi literature, the mole is the outward manifestation of the dot. The hair, for example, is again, there are many concepts relating to hair, and again it can be seen at the mundane level, and therefore falls into another line of poetry. But in reality, the author, especially if he's an Arab, especially if he's a person who's reached a high level of gnosis and ma'rifah, the hair to him reflects the multiplicity that is one. So to us these are in some ways contrived schemes, and they are contrived and maybe forced mechanisms of understanding. But for those who are born and bred and raised in the worship, in the true worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in a true sense of gnosis and understanding, these metaphors and these symbols are used just as a matter of routine. So we should not think of them now because we do not use them. We do not use these metaphors and symbols that they do not have. It talks about the mole on Layla's face. Any person reading it now would say this person is besotted with Layla. But in reality, it reflects the love of the divine attributes. It reflects the station of longing of being near the beauty and majesty of Allah. And animals have their usages also in Sufi poetry. The peacock, for example. The peacock is seen as a symbol of light when it first emanates and recognizes itself in a mirror, sees itself as a peacock. There's a purported saying of Prophet ﷺ is that the self, when it saw itself reflected, it saw itself as a peacock with its tail outspread. So the splendor of the peacock, when he recognizes himself, or artistically, this splendor of the self-recognition of light when reflected from the mirror of perfection. Mind is always associated with action. It's always associated with the principle, and it's associated with the universal prototype acting in this world. And in the latter period, it's always associated with Imam Ali alayhi salam. And is again not to be seen as a devouring, consuming monster. It's a typical archetype of the perfect man in action. Prophets again have their own literary usages. We talked about Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam and his intensity of his intimacy. He's known as of that station of the person who is in burning proximity to Allah. The beauty of Yusuf alayhi salam is again a reflection of the Prophet Joseph is seen also in terms of that. Alexander, although he's not a prophet, he's known in Arabic as Zulqarnain, is seen in Sufi literature as the heart, basically the heart of the mystic, the heart of the person who is reaching a certain level or a certain degree of certainty. And it is because really it is seen as from Ayat al-Nur, La Sharqiyya, La Gharbiyya. He is neither of the East nor of the West. The historic Alexander, who moved from Greece and conquered the unknown world and ended up in Bactria and so on, was internalized. His exploits and his conquests were internalized in the history and the lore of nearly all of that part of the world that we call Greater Khorasan, or northeastern Iran. The word Iskandar, for example, Iskandar is a commonly used name in northern Pakistan, and because of the internalization of this cosmic Alexander, as it were, as part of the lore of these people, that he is neither of the East nor of the West, he is both, and he brings into their culture, into their history, a certain bridging of all the disparate forces unified under him. So Alexander, or the symbol of Alexander, or the use of the literary Alexander in Sufi literature, is typically the person who is neither of the East nor of the West, the person who is truly enlightened. Against that opposite, there's the symbols of demonic forces, which is Juj and Majuj, used in the Quran in a different context when we use them in Sufi literature. Basically, it's Alexander on one side, reflecting the man or the person who is reaching a state of inner Quran, conquering Juj and Majuj. Has been used by the great poets, and really as a reflector of the divine name Al-Khaliq, that is the creator, Al-Ari, the originator, and the Musawwir. And it is in these three levels, the level of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the creator from ex nihilo, out of nothing, the as the body, as the originator, the force that forms creation, which is the Al-Musawwir, and the form in which creation originates, which is the body, is again used frequently as a metaphor. Or Maryam is used as a metaphor frequently for the divine forces of creation, the divine forces of origination, and the divine forces of form making. So references to Maryam must be seen in that context, that from her, the divine spirit, creation came about. Form of creation was made. Amongst the Shia, there is also in their literature, and when I say Shia, I really do not mean Shia in the jurisprudence of Fatima, seen also symbolically in her relationship with Prophet ﷺ, but in her relationship as the daughter of the universal man. So she has in her the capacity of transmitting through the generations, through time, the prototype of the universal man. Nabi Allah Adam is seen as a primordial man, and Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is always seen as the finality of all temporal existence, and is therefore, talking about them in academic sense, but they are imbued in all Sufic literature. The repetition of numbers, the meaning of numbers, the meaning of 0, the meaning of the number 7, the meaning of the number 2, they all have a certain function in the scheme of representation. And of course there are certain terms relating specifically to poetry that you have to understand, and I think you have to understand it very well, otherwise we fall into the trap of materializing them. One of them is the word wine, or khamr. Wine inevitably means the state of absolute ecstasy achieved by the arif or the seeker when he is in a state of mushahada, when he has a vision of the beloved. And it is a symbol of the absolute. So khamr, wine, is that. It is nothing else but that. And for example, Hafiz, who has many, all kinds of references to wine. There's been a debate going on for decades, whether he's an erotic poet or whether he's an illuminated poet. In reality, he's an illuminated poet. And there's no question about that, because it requires the mind of the Arif and the Gnostic to be able to understand what this man is saying. Otherwise, you fall into the trap of all Orientalists and try to materialize, to quantify and phenomenalize what he's saying. Saqi, which in Arabic means the cupbearer or the wine bringer, the fellow who pours the wine, is always the person who brings love and affection, and is therefore the presence of the Shaykh. So when he says, "Oh Saqi, pour me the wine," it means, "Oh Shaykh," in reality what it means, "Oh Shaykh, lead me to the knowledge of the Absolute." Taban, we call now the kharabat, in Persian it's called maykhana. It is really, again, must be seen in terms of what it is, that it is the heart of the mystic. It's a dwelling place of the people who seek the love of Allah. And the khammar, or the vintner, the person who makes the wine, is basically the absolute perfect disciple of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And in that light, the whole poetry begins to come alive, and we are able to relate to what these people are saying. Antar al-Tabant, a person who goes around Khabat and ruins and so on, is a person who is free of himself. And a sakan, or a drunkard, is a person who is drowned in the absolute unity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Going about science of letters, inshallah we'll talk about that later when we discuss the hurufiyya of the great master Istarabadi, although I know it's not too keen on letters and numbers and so this is the background to trying to understand the symbols and the metaphors and the allegories of all Sufi literature. I chose to talk this way rather than to discuss a particular poem because it's not a literary class, and I'm not a great literary expert. All I can do is to tell you that the Conference of the Birds, or Multiple Poem, in my mind, is the finest allegorical poem I've ever read. The Matnawi obviously is another set of parameters applied to it. Matnawi is a huge work, but for a book that is really not more than 100 pages, it overloads from anything like that. It's something that is really well worth reading, and I think you will enjoy it far more if you put some of the verses to the symbolic significance. Attar himself, his name is Abu Ahmed Muhammad. His father was Attar. Attar means in Arabic the herbalist, or a doctor, actually, a doctor who deals in herbs and so on, or pharmacist. He's born in Nishapur, which is again Greater Khorasan, the birthplace of most of the great masters that I know. He's born in Nishapur according to the most recent research, 517 Common Era. And he is probably with Sana'i, the founder of the Persian modern, well not modern, but the switch from Arabic into Persian by the Persian speakers as the literary medium. The first one is Ferdowsi, but he's not I wouldn't put him in the Sana'i were the first, and as Rumi said, Attar is the spirit, Sana'i is his eye, and I follow in their train. Attar traveled, as it was wont in those days, throughout the then Muslim world, and went to India, went to Mecca several times, went to Iraq, Turkestan, also Ray, which is one of the Bahrainis. So going through travels, he came and settled in actually Mashhad, not in Nishapur, where Imam Rida is there. He wrote 114 books of literature, and Sayyid left that place after he settled in Mashhad. So again to his biographer, especially his modern Iranian biographer. He never wrote anything in praise of anyone, except of Imam Ali. And that's why towards the end of his life, he was accused of being a Shia by some of the alims of that area, and having been practicing Sunni all his life. But there was some dispute whether he became in fact a Shia or not. It really doesn't matter. It's immaterial. He was a true lover of Ahlul Bayt. But because of this attribution, he was hounded and finally withdrew from teaching. And he, right old the age of 90 or something, until Genghis Khan, the Mongols, invaded Nishapur, and he was killed there. There are many stories as to how he was killed. The one that I have read by a man called an Indian author by the name of Nahman, Shibli Nahman, has a very the Mongol armies were coming. One of the soldiers seized him and threatened to kill him, and unless he paid him 1,000 tumans. So Attar told him, I'm not worth that much. Then another soldier came and said, I'll kill him for a handful of twigs. Attar says, you may kill me because I'm not worth that. Apparently he was killed after that. And he incensed the soldier, and in true hagiographical fashion, the soldier repented and spent the rest of his life tending Attar's grave. His book, Mantiq Attar, I'd just like to go through a summary of it. In case you have not read it, I really strongly encourage you to read it. It's basically the birds of the world and their symbolic meaning, how to find a king. And they're sitting there debating what are the qualities of the king and what he should have and how he should rule them and so on and so forth, when the hudhud or the hoopoe shows up, wearing a crown. And they immediately are struck by his presence, and they are taken by him, by his words of wisdom and eloquence. He tells them that earthly kingship is you're after a will-o-the-wisp. The real king is this same one, this legendary bird, who lives on top of Mount Attar. And we, all the birds of the world, should go to him in order to ask him to rule us. The same word, from him emanates all knowledge, all wisdom, and we as birds are merely a reflection, the shadow of this same word. The road, he tells them, the journey is long and perilous, full of pitfalls, full of dangers, full of tricks, but it is necessary and worthy to embark on the journey, because it is only the same word who will tell them what is their true nature, how best they should be lived. So he basically revs them all up, and the birds are all anxious to now move on. And by lottery, it falls on the hudhud or the hoopoe to lead them, and to lead them on the journey. Then before they embark on the journey, some of the birds start making noises and showing their anxieties. The nightingale saying, if I go on this journey, I'm going to miss my rose, and I'll miss her smell, and I'll miss her scent, and I'll miss this, I'll miss that. How to dissuade by telling them that all you are worshipping is ephemeral, and it will die and wither. So he again tells them, you're taking us on this mountain, this desert, there's all kinds of parched land and parched territories, there's no water, how can I live without my water? Again, the hoopoe or the hudhud convinces him to come along the journey by talking with the familiar in order to explore the unknown. Tells him about, if he goes on this, how will he find prey? How am I going to eat? How am I going to survive? There's no food up Mount Attar. He tells us all valleys and so on, and dangers lurking. There's nothing can survive there. How am I going to eat? Then again he convinces him using the allegory of the only one, seeking the saving. Finally, as they're going up the mountain, a lot of the birds drop out, a lot of the birds return, some die. He would lead them through the 7 valleys. And the valleys, of course, reflect or relate these stages or these stations or the halis or the maqams or the seeker. He goes through the valley of uns, which is the valley of intimacy. They pass through the valley of wisdom, the valley of cutting off all ties, the valley of union, the valley of hira, of perplexity, the valley of tajreed, of poverty, and finally the valley of annihilation. Thousands drop dead, thousands return. Finally, those who reach the peak are 30. And 30 in Persian is Seymurg, 30 birds. So basically, when they reach self-realization, they recognize that what they were seeking was really in themselves in the first place. And when the 30, when they get there, they recognize the reality that within them is the microcosm, within them is the macrocosm, within them is the whole story of creation. I remember here in the poem, there are a number of side stories. One of them really a beautiful story relating to a person called Shaykh Fadhlalla, who is a great teacher and a great man and a humble man and so on, and has a huge following, who finally becomes despicably debauched and does all kinds of incredible things because he falls in love with a Christian girl. And the story of his decline and fall and finding redemption is a very interesting story. There's also a number of stories about Sultan Mahmud al-Ghaznawi, who is a real historical figure, who was one of the early conquerors of northern India, who Islamicized large parts of India. And obviously he was a legendary figure in those days for all that part of the Muslim world. These stories continue. There's a lot of stories relating to Sultan Mahmud and his servant Ayad. Again, it's an allegory of the service, the true fidelity of the true servant to his master. To conclude just by reading a few stanzas from the last section of Conference of the Birds, when they reach the end, when they reach the Simurg. The 30 birds read through the fateful page, and there discovered, stage by detailed stage, their lives, their actions set out one by one, all that their souls had ever been or done. And this was bad enough, but as they read, they understood that it was they who led the lovely Joseph into slavery, who had deprived him of his liberty, deep in a well, then ignorantly sold their captive to a passing chief for gold. Can you not see that at each breath you serve, the Joseph you imprisoned in that well, that he will be the king in whom you must, naked and hungry, bow down in the dust? The chastened spirits of these birds became like crumpled powder, and they shrank with shame. Then, as by shame their spirits were refined, of all the world's weight they began to find, a new life flowed towards them from that bright, celestial and ever-living light. Their souls rose free of all that they had been before. The past and all its actions were no more. Their life came from that close, incessant sun, and in its vivid rays they shone as one. There in the Seymurg's radiant face they saw themselves, the Seymurg of the world, with awe. They gazed and dared at last to comprehend they were the Seymurg and the journey's end. They see the Seymurg, at themselves they stare, and see a second Seymurg standing there. They look at both and see the two are one, that this is that this, the goal is one. They ask, but inwardly they make no sound, the meaning of these mysteries that confound their puzzled ignorance. How is it true that we is not distinguished here from you? And silently their shining Lord replies, I am a mirror set before your eyes, and all who come before my splendor see themselves their own unique reality. You came as 30 birds and therefore saw their self-same 30 birds, not less, not more.
If you had come as 40-50 here, an answer in 40-50 would appear. Though you have struggled, wandered, traveled far, it is yourselves you see and what you are. Who sees the Lord? It is himself each sees. What ant's sight could discern the Pleiades? What anvil could be lifted by an ant? Or could a fly subdue an elephant? How much you thought you knew and saw, but you now know that all you trusted was untrue. Though you traversed the valley's depth and thought, with all the dangers that the journey brought, the journey was in me, the deeds were mine. You slept secure in being's inmost shrine. And since you came as 30 birds you see, these 30 birds when you discover me, the same wood, truth's last flawless jewel delight, in which you will be lost to mortal sight. Dispersed to nothingness until once more you find in me the selves you were before. Then as they listened to the same wood's words, a trembling dissolution filled the birds, the substance of their being was undone, and they were lost like shade before the sun. Neither the pilgrims nor their guide remained, the same word ceased to speak, and silence reigned. With introduction by Afghan Darbandi and Dick Davis. The question.
You identify
The question. I want to be the whole word. But I'm afraid I might end up like the hawk, always wondering where my prey is. I don't think anybody who reads Persian or Farsi, this is probably a very pale shadow of what it's like. But in Arabic, rhyme translation, which comes in some cases quite close to it, untold the Persian. So when people talk about Islamic forms of art and so on, they are really talking about Tawheed, because that's what it's all about. The artists, those who drew, who wrote, who composed, who planned, who designed, they had only one thing in their mind, that their art was a reflection of their sense of Tawheed. It was not that the scale was different, the purpose was different. The purpose was to recognize and glorify the unity of Allah.